Hey guys, hoping all is well with everyone. So in this video we're going to be continuing the read along of the Secret Zoo Traps and Specters, and the last time we finished off we completed chapter 7 through 59, and the overall recap of it was pretty much the scouts kind of getting out of their puzzling predicaments. So it involved kind of Megan getting saved by Tamron, when she was compromised in the confines of the classroom that the Sasquatch was guarding, and Richie using his liquid ink pen from his nerd gear that kind of blinded the Sasquatch, but also got Ella for whatever reason. Richie thought that Sasquatch could be dressed as Wonder Woman, and then all of the scouts kind of just met up inside of the school. So that's where we're kind of at, and at the very end they kind of found a maintenance room that was kind of blocked off, and that's kind of where they're at right now, is kind of huddling together and getting strategies inside this maintenance room. Chapter 60, The Cellar. The maintenance room was the size of a classroom and crowded with large appliances that hummed, sputtered, and spat. Pipes stretched across the open space, connecting steel boxes, disappearing into the walls, and passing through valves with large red handles. One appliance had so many pipes jutting from it that Noah was reminded of a spider. There was no sign of Charlie, but the back of the room had a large door, and it was open. Sam turned to the scouts. "You know where that goes?" The scouts shook their heads. Sam considered the door for a moment, then said, "Come on." As he moved toward it, his wings sweeping along the equipment, the other crossers followed, Tamron's long tail stroking the floor like a sinuous body of a huge snake. At the open door, Sam bent down to pick up something. He showed it to the others, a broken padlock. This door was normally kept locked. As the crossers moved closer, they were met with a cool draft of air. They peered over one another's shoulders. A steep flight of dusty concrete steps led to a dirt floor. A cellar. An old one. Richie said, "This has got to be from the old school. The one they demolished." The other scouts nodded in agreement. Sam pointed down. In the ground several feet from the bottom step was a faint impression of a large foot with hooked claws. A Sasquatch had been there. But the toe prints were facing the steps, as if the Sasquatch had walked out from the cellar rather than in. Sam headed down the stairs, waving his hand for the others to follow. As Noah stepped down, the underground air overwhelmed him. The decades-old smell of must and earth seemed to have a weight. Directly off the staircase was a long hall, roughly 6 feet across and 100 feet long. Both of the uneven concrete walls had 4 carved-out sections for doors. The hall was dimly lit by a few bulbs that dangled overhead in simple fixtures. Dust had settled across everything: the lights, the floors, the pebbly concrete. With soft and cautious footsteps, Sam led the slow charge into the hall. None of the crossers dared to speak. A Sasquatch had been there. How and why? No one knew. Where were the others? And what about Charlie Red? Sam peered through the doorway into the first room on his left. He looked around and then glanced back at the crossers. With a nod, he led everyone deeper down the hall. As Noah passed the room, he looked inside to see an old furnace covered in a layer of dirt. Pipes reached out from its large steel body and punched through the ceiling like the arms of a robotic octopus. The dirt floor absorbed the sounds of their footfalls. Other than the drone of their appliances back in the maintenance room, the world had fallen eerily silent. Sam peered into the doorway to his right. Empty. He led the group further and stared into a new doorway. Again, nothing, and the group pressed on. Roughly 50 feet away, a figure strolled out from the room near the end of the hall, and the crossers froze. The figure casually turned and faced their group, the dim light revealing Charlie Red. Sam said, "Red, it's over." Charlie chuckled. "I hardly think so." Look around, Solana said. There's 8 of us and 1 of you, and we've got you against the wall. Charlie looked into the dark shadows behind him. A dead end? That's right, Sam said. How can you be sure? The crosser said nothing. After a few seconds, Charlie continued. Before you charge down and apprehend me, can I offer some help with something? Sam looked puzzled. He said nothing. Would you like your radios working again? You jammed them. How? You underestimate me, Charlie said. He unclipped a walkie-talkie from his hip and raised it to his lips. Please give the airways back to our friends. Over. Sam said, Who are you talking to? Who else is in on... Go ahead and try, Charlie said. Huh? Your headsets. Try them now. Everyone reached to their ears and turned the headsets on. The pulsing sound was gone. Nice, Charlie said. Now, you're probably going to want to radio in a request. A what? Charlie chuckled. He didn't speak for what seemed a long time. At last he said, How far are you willing to go to keep the secrets of your precious zoo safe? The crossers stayed silent and waited for more. Noah felt his heart beating way too fast. You've got quite a mess upstairs, Charlie said. It's going to be a real tough to cover up. The kind of damage... What will you blame it on? Humans can't do that. But some animals can. Noah's stomach sank as he realized what Charlie was getting at. He wanted Sam to radio back to the secret society and have them release some animals into the Clarksville Elementary. Gifteds, for certain animals, that could respond to commands from people and move easily into action. And animals large enough to cause destruction like this. No! Noah said. He jumped forward and grabbed Sam's arm. Don't! Charlie lifted the walkie-talkie to his lips and radioed his unknown contact a second time. Can you also call our friends at the Clarksville police? It seems there's been a terrible break-in at the school. Sam began very quiet and very still. Then he glanced over at Cameron, who reluctantly nodded at him, a scowl on his mostly masked face. Into his bone mic, Sam said, Anyone out there? Noah squeezed Sam's arm. No! The descender shrugged off Noah's hand. It has to be done. Noah glanced down the hall and watched the smile spread on Charlie's face. A voice filled the radio waves. Jay here. You back online? I was starting to think. Jay, I need you to send 2 of our biggest animals to the schools. Gifteds. What for? We got a mess, and we need to clean it up. There was a pause from Jay as he seemed to realize what Sam was getting at. Sam wasn't just looking for assistance. He was looking for sacrifices. Who do you want? Sam stared at the ground and shook his head in what seemed to be regret and disgust. Blizzard and Little Big. Sam! No! This time it was Ella. The police! They'll kill them! Noah understood this might be the best way to keep the secret zoo safe, but every piece of his heart told him it was the wrong call. Blizzard and Little Bighorn were his friends, not pawns in a chess match. After a few seconds, Jay said, Sam, you sure we can't? Send them, Sam said, and do it quick. The cops are already on their way. Hearing this, Charlie Red smiled, his freckles seeming to squirm across his cheeks. Ella stepped forward and jabbed her finger at Charlie. You knew this was going to happen. You wanted the Sasquatches to smash up the school. Well, that much is obvious, I think. But aren't you curious about why we're standing here? He gestured toward the walls. In this filthy cellar? The crosser said nothing. Noah saw that Sam's feathers had begun to tremble. I brought you here, Charlie said. For him. Noah suddenly realized something. Charlie was no longer wearing the outfit that looked like Degraff's. He had on his usual security guard uniform. Guys, Noah said, this tone heavy with concern. Where is... Before Noah could get his question out, he had his answer. A tall man emerged from the same door Charlie had come through. He wore a fedora hat and a flowing trench coat. Degraff, the shadowist. For real this time. Sam took a step forward and raised his arms out to the height of his waist, shielding the other crossers with a wall of silver feathers. Degraff found a spot beside Charlie. He stared up the hall, his face cloaked in the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. His trench coat, draped around his feet, was as dark and featureless as the shadows around him. He wore black, pointed-toe boots and sleek leather gloves. His arms dangled at his sides, and his hands were closed into his fists. For a long time, no one said a word. The two groups simply faced off from opposite ends of the long hallway. The overhead bulbs cast cones of light along the walls and floor. Richie stared out with wide eyes through his oversized glasses. Ella hid behind Solana, peering around the descender's quill-covered arm. Megan stood sideways, looking poised to jump in any direction. Noah felt something strike his heels, and he looked down to see Tamron's tail twining through the crosser's feet. Degraff, Sam said at last. That is your real name, isn't it? For a long time, it seemed the man wouldn't answer. Then his hat bobbed up and down in a yes response. What do you want? Sam said. After a long pause, Degraff spoke for the first time. Everything. His voice gurgled out, as if his throat was coated in phlegm. He sounded human, but barely alive. He slowly lifted his arm and pointed a gloved finger at Sam. But I'll start with you. The shadowist suddenly jumped forward and swung his arm over his head with unexpected agility. His hand struck a dangling fixture and sent it into a wild swing. Beams of light carved through the darkness. He took several long strides and smacked a second fixture, which reeled in all directions, casting light across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. What happened next was impossible. Degraff disappeared. 1 second he was there, and the next he was not. Where is he? Tamron shouted. Noah quickly recalled the stories he heard from Jonathan Degraff, the legends and the half-truths. It was said he could walk into the shadows, move among them, become them. The bulbs continued to swing around and around, striping the walls with light. The shadows in the hallway seemed to come alive. Noah wondered if they had. There was a muffled scream, and then one of Sam's wings swept across the group. Degraff had appeared behind Sam, his hand covering the teenager's mouth. The shadowist had something in his grasp, a piece of velvet, like that in the curtains and the descender's clothes. Sam struggled for a second, then his expression fell flat, his body limp. Whatever was in the cloth, a chemical, the magic itself, had rendered him unconscious. Sam toppled over, his wings dusting the walls. His head bounced on the dirt floor, and an instant later, Degraff grabbed his arms and dragged him toward Charlie Red, flashes of light revealing the horrifying scene in fragments, like a movie with frames missing. As the two of them moved into the shadow, they vanished and immediately appeared in the dim light at the end of the hall. It was as if they'd fallen into the darkness, as if Degraff had taken Sam there. Then Degraff dragged the descender's limp body through the open doorway that he and Charlie had stepped through. It had all happened so quickly. 2, maybe 3 seconds. The fixtures continued to swing, making it feel as though the flash of lightning had something become trapped in the narrowest cavity of the hall. Hannah was the first to react, screaming out Sam's name and charging up the hallway. After a few steps, her body swung violently to one side, and she banged into the wall. Degraff was behind her, his hand pressed to her face, the piece of velvet covering her nose and mouth. Hannah struggled for a few seconds. Then her body went limp, and Degraff seized her wrists, and the two of them disappeared into the darkness left by a flash of light. A second later, she was being dragged into the same room as Sam. Charlie stood at the end of the hall, smiling. Then he turned and walked into the room. His work was done here. Degraff would manage the rest. Tamarin looked at Solana. "The scouts! Get them out of here!" Solana didn't hesitate. She grabbed Megan and Ella's shoulders, spun them around, and pushed them toward the exit, yelling, "Go!" in a half-trembling voice. Richie followed. As Solana yanked Noah ahead of herself, Noah's gaze landed on one wall, and he realized bugs were climbing on it. Big bugs, the kind from distant lands. He saw plump-bodied spiders, giant cockroaches, and spiny-legged things with shiny shells. At first, Noah had no idea where they were coming from, but then he figured it out. Him. Degraff. Somehow the Shadowbus was leaving a trail of bugs. It was as if the insects were falling out of his body. As the scouts headed for the exit, Noah heard a struggle behind him and realized Tamarin was being taken down. He glanced over his shoulder to see the Descender's enormous tail sweeping through the air and banging against the walls. Then it dropped to the ground and lay there, like the tail of a dead dinosaur. Noah ran. He ran as fast as he ever had. He chased the scouts across the cellar and up the stairs to the maintenance room. But as he reached the top step, he heard a muffled cry behind him and glanced over his shoulder. Degraff had moved in behind Solana and was now pressing his velvet to her face. The Descender was staring straight ahead, her eyes bulging with terror. With one arm extended and fingers splayed, she was reaching for help. Noah stopped. It took only a second for Degraff to choke the consciousness out of his friend. Her knees buckled, and her body dropped to the hard ground. Dozens of her quills were embedded in the front of Degraff, but they didn't seem to hurt him. Noah didn't know what was protecting Degraff, his leather jacket or his magic. Noah turned to his friends, but they had already charged out of the maintenance room and into the school hall. He swung his head back. Solana still lay on the ground, her long hair spilled out around her, her lips coated in dirt. As Degraff hoisted her legs and began to drag her down the hall by her ankles, pictures of Solana flashed in Noah's mind. He saw her standing in Metropolis on their first encounter, walking through Koala Castle, and sitting so close to him on the bench in the Forest of Flight. Something ignited in his chest, and his entire body flushed with heat, a heat which burned away all fear. A second later, he felt the soles of his feet pounding the steps, and he was running up the hall after Solana. After a swinging shadow passed over Degraff, and stepped 20 feet through it into the light and the end of the hall, dragging his captive. "No!" Noah heard himself yell, but his words weren't really coming from him. They were coming from a place inside of him, a place of unspent emotions and untold secrets, a place full of power. As Degraff dragged Solana into the room where he had taken the others, Noah charged across the cellar, adrenaline coursing through his body. He raced past the first room, the second, the third, the insects bursting beneath his feet. At the end of the hall, he returned into the room. Small, it had concrete walls, a dirt floor, and pipes along the ceiling. Degraff was headed to a place along the far side, the site on which Noah stopped in his tracks. This outside wall had a hole big enough to fit two side-by-side adults. On the floor was a dusty pile of rubble, jagged concrete pieces that had once been a part of the wall. Bunched to one side on the opening was a velvet curtain, the kind used in the portals of the secret zoo. Beyond it, a dark tunnel descended steeply into the ground, tree roots and clumps of earth dangling from its walls and ceiling. The shadow was stopped at the mouth of the tunnel. He turned his head, and what Noah saw terrified him. Degraff didn't have a nose, just two holes in his face. The better part of his chin was missing. His top lip and the flesh above it were gone, exposing a black gum line and rotten teeth. The rest of his face was still intact, except for a wide tear along his cheek that exposed a strip of white bone. His skin looked rubbery and strange, as if it weren't skin at all, but an elastic material wrapped around his head, something to keep his flesh from spilling out. Noah remembered something Sam had once said. Others say Degraff is part shadow and part human, rotting flesh held together by the shadow's magic. Degraff had been alive over 100 years. What remained of his body was barely more than a corpse. The only part of Degraff that Noah couldn't see were his eyes. Beneath the brim of his fedora hat, they stay hidden. Degraff tipped his head to one side to size up Noah. As he did, a large centipede crawled out from the gash in his cheek and disappeared into the collar of his trench coat. He reached up and casually scratched the skin below the wound, as if the centipede's legs had tickled. The skin along the bottom of its mouth curled upward, and Noah realized in a sickening way that Degraff was smiling. The shadowist made a deep, guttural sound, almost like a croak, that then started to step backward into the tunnel, dragging his captive along. Just as Solana was about to be pulled into the tunnel, Noah felt his feet moving again, and he realized he was charging straight at the hole in the wall. In the edges of his vision, the room blurred, and just before he would have trampled Solana, he dove into the air with so much force that it felt like he was flying. He plowed his shoulder into Degraff's gut, buckling him and freeing Solana from his grasp. The two of them crashed down the steep tunnel and went into a roll, Degraff's knees and elbows knocking against Noah, and the flaps of his open jacket slapping Noah's face. As Noah came to a stop about 10 feet from the mouth of the tunnel, he spun onto his back and stared across his body to see Degraff farther below. About 50 feet behind Degraff, a Sasquatch head was dragging Tamarin into the black, hidden depths. Bugs, by the hundreds, were swarming on the dirt walls, spiders and beetles and other unnameable things. Only once had Noah seen so many insects in the secret creepy critters when he and Podgy had brought down the portal to the Gator Falls. Degraff lifted his head to stare at Noah. His fedora hat was still in place, still masking his eyes. Noah could see that the two holes where his nose should have been were now packed with dirt, and spiders were pouring out of the wound in his cheek and skittering across his face, some disappearing beneath the flaps of his loose flesh. With his insides churning with revulsion, Noah spun over onto his stomach and began to crawl up the steep incline, his feet occasionally slipping in the dirt. He glanced back to see that Degraff was following, just as Noah clapped down one hand on the hard dirt floor of the cellar. He felt something squeezing his left ankle, and he realized Degraff had him in his clutches. Noah's fingers slipped through the dirt as he was pulled down. He turned onto his back and thought of the descenders. Sam, Hannah, and Tamarin. What fate waited for them at the end of this tunnel? Whatever it wasn't going to be Noah's or Solana's. He hoisted his right knee all the way up to his chest and then brought it down with the strength he had. The sole of his boot landed squarely on Degraff's cheek, whose head rocked back as his hat tumbled off. As Degraff put both hands onto his injured face, Noah dove through the mouth of the tunnel and landed beside Solana. He knew what he needed to do next. In the tunnel beneath Gator Falls, he'd seen what had happened to a gateway once it was stripped of its magic curtain. Noah got to his knees. As he reached up for the curtain, he caught sight of Degraff again. The gash in his cheek was larger, and his face was dotted with the guts of spiders. He had short, unruly hair with bald patches. And his eyes were gone. What remained were two black sockets, as dark as the skull cavities of his nose. The shadow sprang off his knees toward the mouth of the tunnel, and Noah yanked on the curtain, pulling it free from its rod. As more than a dozen gold rings clinked down on the floor, the clunks of the concrete around Noah began to shift and shake. Then all at once, they jumped into the air and fit into their previous spots in the wall, like pieces of a puzzle. They closed the hole and sealed its cracks. Degraff and the portal were gone. Noah leaned over Solana, calling her name. He lightly shook her shoulders. "Wake up!" When she didn't respond, he slapped her cheek. Hard. Solana closed her open mouth and then pursed her lips when she felt the dirt on them. She crunched up her face and slowly opened her eyes to peer at Noah. 3 figures appeared at the door. Noah's friends, their eyes full of fright. They charged into the room and dropped down to their knees by Solana. "We got halfway down the hall and realized you weren't with us," Megan said. "What happened?" Noah ignored his sister and kept his attention on Solana, saying, "You okay?" Solana shifted her gaze and took into the room. Her eyes quickly filled with awareness and life, and she propped herself up on her elbows. "What?" she said. "Degraff." "Gone." Noah lifted one end of the curtain toward Solana and said, "A portal." He helped her to a seated position. "You okay?" he asked again. Solana nodded as she rubbed her eyes. "Portal?" Richie asked. "How?" Noah shook his head. "I don't know." A noise suddenly invaded the room from above, a shrill, pulsating wail muffled by dirt and concrete. It was the sound of sirens. Police sirens. Noah raised his gaze toward the ceiling. "Blizzard and Little Big," he said. "No!" He hooked his arm under Solana's and with Ella's help hoisted her up. Solana swayed on her feet and then quickly found her balance. "Come on, we gotta go," Noah urged. As he headed for the door, Solana stopped him, saying, "Wait." "Huh?" She pointed to the curtain on the floor. "Oh." Noah turned back and balled the curtain up under his arm. "Right." He led the charge out of the room and down the hall, where the gooey remains of dead bugs were spread along the floor like spatterings of paint. As he went, he kept glancing over his shoulder to ensure Solana was stable on her feet. Ella was still helping her a bit. As Noah made his way up the stairs, he said, "Come on, we gotta help Blizzard and Little Big." "No," Solana said. Noah stopped and peered back. Solana now looked as strong as she ever had, and Noah guessed the effects of the velvet had already worn off. "We can't. You have to let them go. It's part of their willing to do. It's part of what they want to do." But Noah would not stand by while Blizzard and Little Bighorn were made sacrifices. "It's not what I want to do," he said, as he charged the rest of the way up the stairs, the rest of the group following. And I'll stop the video there, ending chapter 60, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Things got really intense really quickly. And as you guys can see, Degraff has just this incredible, like, almost manipulative way of using the shadows to his advantage as kind of like a mysterious magic. So it's almost interesting what kind of thoughts that you think of when you're thinking of how you take out a shadow. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please take good care of yourselves and be safe. And in our next video, we'll be continuing our read along of the Secret Zoo Traps and Specters as we near closer and closer to the end of the book. But I hope you guys enjoyed, and we hope to see you very soon. Thanks so much for watching. Bye.